J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. I'm J. Warner Wallace, and today we have a guest that I think has written a really important book, especially for those of you who have friends or family members who are LDS. But to be honest, this book is not really, it would be helpful if you didn't have anybody who was LDS, if you just wanted to know what are the attributes, what is the nature of Christianity, and how do I communicate that to my friends and family, maybe who have no idea what Christianity teaches on a variety of topics. This book will also be valuable for you. And my friend here is Eric Johnson, who's just written a book, which you can get right now. It's already been released, called Introducing Christianity to Mormons. Eric, you have done so much work with LDS. Would you just give us a few seconds of kind of your background, how you got interested in reaching this important people group?
A guy named Jim Jones in 1978 told people to drink the poison Kool-Aid, and they did in Guyana. 1,000 people committed suicide. I was a junior in high school. I really needed an opportunity to own my own faith, and that really did it for me. I ended up reading a lot of scriptures of other people's religions. People came to the door. I'd invite them inside at the college campus, San Diego State. I got to talk to Hare Krishnas and many others, took world religions classes. And I think that's really where I grew up in a Christian home, but I owned my faith at that point.
So then what was it? And you say you were talking to people at the door. Of course, Mormons are going to be part of that group that comes to the door. Is that what first got you interested in LDS then?
Well, and actually that is. Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons were the most likely to come to the door where I lived in Southern California. Mm-hmm. But we even had Children of God and Moonies who came back in the day. You know, that's the Jesus movement and all the things that took place. But in 1983, I met a man named Jeff Howell, a good friend who's now passed on with the Lord. Mm-hmm. But he introduced me to a ministry he had called Making Disciples Ministry. So we specialize in Jehovah's Witnesses, New Age. A woman named Terry Cole Whitaker was very big New Age teacher in California, and we did a lot of research on her. And we also did some things with Mormons. And then I went to Utah in Salt Lake City, 1987 in the summer, and spent the entire summer here. And I fell in love with the Latter-day Saint people, because they're generally nice people and they're willing to talk, unlike the Jehovah's Witnesses, who can be very frustrating. And that's really how I got involved with that. In 1989, I met my friend Bill McKeever of Mormonism Research Ministry. He founded this ministry in 1979. Our ministry's at mrm.org. And I've moved to Utah in 2010 to do this ministry full time.
So you've been there now for well over 10 years, and your family's been there too, growing up, going to school in the same communities, living in the same, shopping in the same communities, working in the same communities. So you've had some firsthand experience. And as I look at the book, and I got a chance to preview it when you first wrote it, and you and I had discussions about the book even before you were out here in the process of writing it. And I remember thinking at the time, when you say introducing Christianity to Mormons, when we first started also working with LDS, my family's I've got my 6 half brothers and sisters who are all raised LDS. So I was interested as an atheist why they believed this to be true. And I remember when I first started talking to LDS, they would have been very quick to tell me that Mormonism was not Christianity, that Joseph had come to restore the church, and in order to restore something, you have to first presume that something has been lost, that has been distorted in some way, that needs restoration, right? And so that was always, even from the prophet down, it really was after Mitt Romney, I think, ran the first time that I started to see a shift where the LDS people, and especially young LDS believers, would see themselves as a denomination of Christianity, and maybe not even be aware of the substantive differences between Christianity and Mormonism. So what do you say to people when they read a title of a book like this, Introducing Christianity to Mormons, and their view is, well, you don't need to introduce it to us. We are Christians.
Oh, that's a good question, Jim. And by the way, thank you for all of the influence you've had in the ministry that I do. I've taken your advice seriously. You know that, and I appreciate your blurb in the book as well to recommend it. But my title is controversial: Introducing Christianity to Mormons, because Mormons are today. And I'm going to even go further. You're saying back in 2012. I think it probably goes back to the turn of the century, where we really see the Latter-day Saints not so much emphasizing their Mormonism, but more, we're Christians just like you. And I don't recommend you go to a Latter-day Saint and say, you're not a Christian. That's
Right.
fighting words. You don't want to do that. You want to use kindness, gentleness, and respect. But introducing Christianity, I'm talking about biblical Christianity. It's a Christian publisher. This book is written for a Christian audience. But and then the word Mormon is controversial too. In 2018, the 98-year-old leader of the church, Russell M. Nelson, decided he was told, he said at night, that Jesus was offended whenever the word Mormon is used. So they took away a brand name, LDS and Mormon. You're not allowed to use that, or Mormonism. And they had LDS.org and Mormon.org. They still have that, but now the official website is called churchofjesuschrist.org. But this is a church where it has the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. They had to change the name of that. This is a church that had an I Am a Mormon campaign. And in fact, back in 1990, 15th President Gordon B. Hinckley said that Mormon meant more good. He says there's worse things we could use. But okay, let's just say that I'm not supposed to use the word Mormon. What am I supposed to call this book, Jim? Introducing Biblical Christianity to Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You know as well as I do that no publisher is going to publish a book that's so confusing when in 4 words I can get the job done.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I think that's interesting, though, because we're in a culture right now, a kind of Orwellian culture, where words and how we use words are powerful. You can change definitions, and suddenly you've changed the entire conversation and the footing of how we begin. I mean, all of this has become confusing in culture to begin with. So I kind of wonder if this just isn't part of a cultural move to use words in a way that achieves a greater goal. But what do you think is the greater goal of Mormons who want, well, I say Mormons, LDS, or Latter-day Saints, who, are we using the word Latter-day Saints, by the way?
Well, you're allowed to use Latter-day Saint to refer to them as a people, but you're not allowed to call it the Church of the Latter-day Saints. In fact, the only 2 names you can call the church would be the Church of Jesus Christ, which I can't do, or the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, which is 47 keystrokes. I can't, that's too long. And so I use that as an abbreviation, not to be offensive, but just to say, come on. I mean, you're a Latter-day Saint. I oftentimes try my best, but as you just did now, you said the word Mormon, and somebody's going to get offended about that. Well, I'm sorry. I mean, we can't be so thin-skinned as to get offended by a word that you were known for before 2018. And I'm not sure why, if Jesus is offended now at that name, why he wasn't offended in 1990 when Gordon B. Hinckley, who wrote a book, What About the Mormons? He actually wrote a book in 1947 with that title. I'm not sure what changed with God.
Well, here's my question. So we're still calling it the Book of Mormon, though, right?
Yeah, that's allowed because Mormon is a person, the character Mormon. Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So my question basically comes down to is that if we've got folks who don't see themselves as different than Christians, are they? Would you think? I'm kind of curious about this. It used to be when I would do a lot of street evangelism in Salt Lake City, that these distinctions were clear and embraced by both sides. That it was never a conversation about having to convince a people group of what it is their founders believed. I mean, a little bit sometimes, but most of it was, no, we accept that this is what our faith system teaches. Now I find myself having to redefine everything. I mean, if God can change his mind about how the word Mormon is to be received, then why can't we say that whatever our founders thought was true has changed now? It's not, we don't have to, just because Joseph or Brigham said it does not mean it's a doctrine, theological doctrine to me, because apparently God does change his mind.
Well, it's a blurring of the lines, and this is the problem. We speak the same language. We're talking to Latter-day Saints, and we use the word God, we use the word Jesus, we use the word salvation by grace through faith. They'll say, of course we believe in those things. But if you don't understand what it is meant when they say those terms, and this is where I really emphasize, I mean, you were involved in the police force for so many years. You got to know the authentic $100 bill. You've got to know what that looks like. And that's what this book is mainly about, is about sharing Christianity, because Mormons are leaving in droves, but you got to know the counterfeit as well. You have to know, how are they producing this to make it look like it's passable bills? The Secret Service spends just as much time looking at the counterfeits as they are looking at the real bill. And so for a Christian who wants to make an impact and to be able to share an appropriate faith, they're going to have to know what the Mormon is understanding when you use the same terms they are. And they're not going to deny the first vision, where God the Father supposedly said that all of the churches were wrong and all their creeds were an abomination in his sight. They're not going to deny that the Book of Mormon is another testament and it's more correct than the Bible. They're not going to deny that salvation comes through by grace after all we can do, 2 Nephi 25:23 in the Book of Mormon. So when you start to ask the appropriate questions, as Greg Koukl does so masterfully in his book Tactics and the Columbo Tactic, you don't tell a Latter-day Saint what he or she believes. You ask them, but don't allow them to pull one over your eyes. Say, wait a minute, are you telling me blank? Because when you understand what Mormonism teaches, it does, Jim, deny or distort every fundamental teaching of the historic Christian church from top to bottom. And the Latter-day Saint, down at heart, most of them at least, know it. They play games of, well, you're a Christian too, but not in the same sense as somebody who belongs to the restored church that was brought back to the earth in 1830 by Joseph Smith.
Okay, so we're going to go through, I'm going to talk specifically about the book in the next segment, but I want to ask one last question in this segment. Look, in the end, how big do you think, there's a sense I have, like when you're in it all the time and you're constantly, I took missions trips to Salt Lake City, to Manti, to all these places we did for years and years as a youth pastor. And I did it for the purpose of teaching theological doctrine, Christian theology to my students, because like you do so well in the book, if you know what it is, you can't really talk about the differences if you don't think there are any. So because we know what's true theologically, we can have these discussions. And I used to take these trips all the time. And when you're doing that, you have a sense that, wow, there's a lot of deceived people who believe something that's not true. But at some point, you kind of wonder, well, how large is this group? Is the group continuing to grow, or is it shrinking? How large do you think the group is? They identify themselves as Latter-day Saints.
Officially 16.8 million, and they're going to have general conference where they announce that every the first weekend of April and October. But in April, that's when they'll make an announcement. Maybe they're going to get to 17 million. More than half of those live outside the United States. 45% speak English as their first language. 35% speak Spanish. I don't know if a lot of people know that. 9% speak Portuguese as their first language. So it is a world religion, there's no doubt. But this is a religion that is not growing in the way it used to. Back in 1990, it grew by 320,000 members, and it was like a 6% growth rate. COVID has really hurt them badly, and even before COVID, they were declining, but they're growing well less than 1%. They are not having the conversion numbers. I'm going to say part of that is just across the board. People are not having much to do with religion, but I think the internet, and since the 1990s, has really affected them since 1990 itself. And ever since that time, we've seen a progressive decline percentage-wise of new members joining the church.
Interesting. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about some of the most important concepts you're going to cover and issues you're going to cover in the book. And we'll do that right back. I'm speaking to Eric Johnson with his new book, a great new book that I think is going to be important for people, even for people who don't necessarily have Mormons in their sights. Introducing Christianity to Mormons actually provides more than just the Mormon audience. We'll do this right after the break.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
What investigative principle does every Christian need?
There's tons of different things you learn as a cold case detective, but probably the one foundational thing you got to begin with is you can't walk into crime scenes with a presupposition about who your suspect's going to be. And that's happened to me before, where I've actually walked into a crime scene and had the senior investigator, who knows a lot more than me, tell me, no, I've been here before, son. I know exactly what kind of a murderer this is going to be. We need to look for X, whatever X is, and he's basing it on what he thinks he sees at the crime scene. And it turns out, on this particular case, he was so sure that the suspect was going to be a boyfriend or a husband that we spent about a week looking for the love interests of the victim, when in fact it wasn't a boyfriend or a husband, it wasn't anybody she knew, it was actually the next door neighbor. Now, interestingly, every piece of evidence we saw in the room, he found a way to interpret it through his lens, his presupposition that this was going to be a boyfriend or a husband. Now, I think something similar happens to us, for me at least, as a non-believer. Something very similar happened as I looked at the evidence for Christianity. I began with a presupposition about naturalism, and I rejected up front any explanation that might be supernatural, like God. But if I begin with that presupposition, I can't really ever get to the clear answer, especially if my question to begin with is, does anything supernatural exist? I can't begin by denying the supernatural. So the first, I think, most important investigative tool we start with is don't be a know-it-all. Don't think you know in advance of your investigation what the answer is going to be. Let the evidence tell you how to get there.
Thanks, John.
Okay, back with Eric Johnson. Now, in your book, it's fascinating to me because we talked about how Mormonism, or Latter-day Saints, that group is probably shrinking, or at least the growth is plateaued or starting to plateau. And so you might wonder, well, why? Then why do I need a book like this? Well, to be honest, you need a book like this for anyone who comes to your door. You probably need a book like this just for your kids. Because if you're a Christian trying to teach your kids, this is a very quick, accessible volume that will not only teach you how to be prepared for anyone who comes to your door, whether that's LDS or otherwise, because it's not going to be specific, let's say, to that worldview. But if you don't know what you believe, then you can't help others know why what they believe is an error. So if you look at the of the book, Eric, and look at your table of contents, you would not know that this is a book that actually focuses on Mormons, because your book really is, it feels like a primer in all things Christian worldview. Like what, it's almost like a systematic theology of sense, and but very, very quickly snapshot of what it is we believe, so that it can be compared to what it is somebody else is trying to tell us. So tell me how it is. I remember when you first started doing this, tell me why did you took this approach where you're just trying to really cover what is true about Christianity for those who aren't Christians?
Because so many people who are leaving the LDS church are not headed towards your evangelical Christian church. In fact, there was a book called The Next Mormons written by Mormon blogger Jana Reese. It was a scholarly book. She has a doctorate, and Oxford printed this, and she did a lot of surveying. In 2019, 45% of everybody who leaves the LDS church goes to atheism, agnosticism, or nothing at all. And I bet that doesn't surprise you, Jim.
No.
So many are headed that direction anyway, all across the board. But another 21% called themselves just Christian. They didn't go to a church or anything. They just left Mormonism, but they didn't want to go anywhere else. But because they're good moral people, therefore they're just Christian. That's 2 out of 3 people who leave the church are going for no hope whatsoever. They're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Only 1/3 chose some kind of a religion. Out of the third, a total across the board, 10%, only 10% become evangelical Christians. I think we have a stronger message, and I think we have truth, is what I'm going to say, that I don't think Latter-day Saints know. They have these misnomers that if the church isn't true, then nothing else is. That's wrong, first off. They'll say that to each other when there's problematic information. And I say, no, that can't be true, because if Mormonism isn't true, then something else has to be. If it's atheism, it's atheism. But there has to be evidence. You always talk about inference to the best explanation. We need to take the evidence we have, lay it out on the table, and see where it directs us. We look both ways when we cross the street. Why won't we at least take a look at what the Bible has to offer and what Christianity has to offer? So this book comes as a result of my daughter asking me back in August of 2020. I just recovered from COVID, and she said, is there a book I can give my LDS friend who just left the church and wants to know what I believe? I said, well, I looked at there's lots of good books out there. You have a good one. Cold Case Christianity is a great book. So is Lee Strobel's Case for Christ. These are good books, but they're not written specifically for the Latter-day Saint audience. And so what I decided to do is kind of do a little bit kind of what you did with Cold Case Christianity, lay out the case for the different reasons why we believe the way we do and present essential Christianity, but using their language. So every one of the 10 chapters includes an evangelism story that is a real story. I have a glossary in the back that explains each of the words that I use that are unique, not only to Christianity, but Mormonism and the ones we share, like God, Jesus, and grace. I describe what the Christian definition is versus the LDS definition. And my hope is that Christians can use this to help give another way to go, because they are leaving so many Latter-day Saints in this last decade have left this church. We need to provide a way for them to be able to understand the basic Christian message. And also, I'm hoping that Christian friends will give this to their coworkers or family members and say, if you really want to know what we believe as Christians, these have the essential issues. Check this out.
Yeah, because what you're talking about here in 10 chapters, it's a quick read, is, what is the nature of the Bible? God's special revelation. The New Testament, is it trustworthy? Is it reliable? The existence of God, reasonable reasons why we believe God exists to begin with. Then you talk about the nature of God. What are his attributes? You talk about Jesus specifically as Savior of his people. You talk about the resurrection and the case for the resurrection as the cornerstone of Christianity. You talk about probably one of the biggest issues for Mormons, the triune nature of God, the Trinity. God in three persons. You talk about what it is to be justified and forgiven of sin. These are very different concepts under Mormon thinking. Although I will tell you, that everyone who's ever had a conversation with Mormons will end up scratching their head thinking, well, it almost sounds like we believe the exact same things, because the way we talk to each other is not clear in terms of our definitions, sanctification, and finally growing in the faith. Now, look, I look at those and I think this is stuff I want my kids to know. Forget about Mormons for a second. I would like my kids to know this to begin with. But what's great about this book is it does specifically compare the two worldviews, so that in the end you're going to get this difference. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think we feel, you tell me if I'm wrong, that Mormons are an important group, is because this is a group that, unlike other groups, is actively seeking to pull. I don't know what the percentage is. Do you know, Eric, what is the percentage of converts to Mormonism that come from some form of Christianity? I bet it's large. Am I right?
Oh, it's more than half, and especially down in Latin America, where everybody's Catholic. And what do? When they come to your door, you say, well, I'm a Christian. What do they say? Well, we're Christians too.
Sure,
well, you say, I believe in Jesus. Well, they point to their badge, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Could we do a study with you? They're trying to baptize you by the second lesson. So it definitely is something that is a real thing. Now, you mentioned the Trinity or grace, justification that comes through faith alone, through grace. There are misnomers. The Latter-day Saint has these presuppositions. They have straw man arguments to use against the Christian. They think that the Trinity is the Father, is the Son, is the Holy Spirit. They'll always ask the question, who was Jesus praying to in the Garden of Gethsemane? Well, it's an easy answer. Jesus was praying to the Father, but Jesus is not the Father. But they think that somehow we're thinking that they're all the same, which, no, we think they're three separate persons. There are three who's and one what. Or salvation by grace. Grace in Mormonism is basically the ability to keep the commandments that God has given to you. Grace in Christianity is what we need in order to have forgiveness of sins, and God does all the work, we don't. So if we can correct their straw man arguments against those kinds of issues, and they know there are differences down deep, they might play this game again of, well, we're all the same. But when you start to ask, well, do you believe that God has a body of flesh and bones? Well, yes, of course he does. Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, verse 22 says that God once lived in another realm as a human being, and that he worshiped a previous God, and that we have the potential to be exalted. But it's not through grace, it's through our obedience to the commandments. So if we can understand those things, and understand what we believe, but then be able to present it in a way that a Latter-day Saint can understand, that's successful evangelism. That is effective communication.
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes too do young people, especially young Mormons, even know what you just said about Doctrines and Covenants? I remember reading through the Book of Mormon, Doctrines and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price before, as a new investigator of the claims of Christianity. I even read the Old Testament because I had Mormons in my family, and they thought, well, he's getting interested, so they gave me a quad. So I'm reading through all of those, but I kind of wondered afterwards how many Mormons are even familiar, not so much with the Book of Mormon, but with Doctrines and Covenants evidence and pearl of great price. It seems like whenever I would mention this, and when you say they'll play that game, I think what you're talking, correct me if I'm wrong, you're really talking about the missionaries that come to your door more so than the average Mormon who might be somebody you go to school with or somebody you work with, right?
I think you're right, and I think when you're talking to a layperson, again, you want to ask those questions. Well, what do you mean when you say this, or what do you believe about so and so? Let them give you the answer so that you take the offensive position, and then that can direct your conversation. But I think knowing what it is you believe when it comes to the existence of God. I highly recommend your book, Cold Case Christianity. And you're not paying me anything to say that, but I'm going to say a book like that, A Case for Christ, those kinds of books are important. You need to know what it is that Christianity has. We have the goods. We have something to offer. We have good reasons and evidence to believe why we do. It's rational for us to accept this. And so I'm telling you, every week I talk to people who have left the church, or almost every week, who are now atheist or agnostic. It's shocking here in Utah how many atheists and agnostics we have. They don't. And I just talking to a guy last week in the bookstore where I volunteer at Sandra Tanner's bookstore, and he was telling me Christianity is no different than Mormonism. You guys have just as much against you as the Mormons do. We spent 45 minutes talking. At the end of the conversation, he was willing not only to take a copy of the New Testament in a modern language that he said he would read, but he also took a copy of my book that I gave him, and he says, "You're right, I need to look at all sides." He had been out of the church for 7 years, but considers himself an atheist. But if you have just some basic background knowledge, like chapter 3, I talk about, we have some good reasons to believe in God. And a book like yours can be helpful in equipping Christians to be able to do the work that your pastor cannot do. You have the ability to do that.
Absolutely. That's a great encouraging story. So tell people where they can find you if they want to go online to learn more about you and the book.
You can go to introducingchristianity.com, one word, introducingchristianity.com. There we have links to the 4 places that I know of you can get the book. If somebody wants to reach out to me, Jim, and I'm fine with that, Eric, ERIC, at MRM.org. ERIC at MRM.org. I'm going to make an offer I don't make on most podcasts, but I think you're probably reaching a lot of people. If there's a Latter-day Saint who's listening, or somebody who's just left the church in the last year, and they would like this book, have them email me, Eric at MRM.org. I will send at my own pocket expense a copy of the book. I'll even sign it as long as they promise to read it. So if they write me, I'll just make sure that you're willing to read it. If you're willing to read it, I'll give you a free copy. I'll do up to 10. I don't know how many people are going to take me up on that offer, but the offer is there. Please don't, if you're a Christian, don't just say, I'm going to give it to a former Mormon or a Mormon themselves. It has to be somebody who would be willing to take it from me.
A great offer. Eric, you're a good man. I appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks so much. And I know this book's going to do fantastic, and I hope it reaches lots of people who need the truth. Thanks again for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.